I think it's important to preface this video by saying that I do consider myself to be a feminist, at least in terms of the central tenets of feminism. I believe that all human beings have fundamentally equal value, that you shouldn't be prejudiced or discriminatory against individuals based on their sex, and that men and women ought to have equal opportunities to education, employment, human rights, same treatment by the courts, etc. I do find myself often bickering with feminists on the internet, so-called feminists, but that is largely out of what I perceive to be their betrayal of those principles, and often, they seem to have quite anti-male double standards and a lack of awareness of their own privileges within so-called patriarchy, which I think is itself, in some countries, now quite a disputable concept. But when we look around the globe, clearly it is not. There are clearly some societies in which patriarchy still exists. And what this video is about, as a feminist who, I suppose, having watched so much Star Trek, I have this vision of the future, and it is a feminist future in which men and women are equal. But at the same time, I realise that there is an obvious problem with this vision. We tend to think, as progressives, that progress is inevitable. But I think there's actually quite a good reason why on this front, the dream of a global feminist utopia might fundamentally be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. And it's really to do with fertility rates, demographic issues, and such the like. And I think there's probably an interesting parallel somewhere in all of this between feminism and the unionization of workers' rights, because unionization is a great idea, but the realities of international competition make it problematic. And actually, it seems to me that unionization only works if it works on a global scale. Because of international competition, the employers just go to other countries and such the like. And this is why, in Britain, unionization has essentially failed on a national level. Because when a nation has unions that become too strong, it means it cannot compete in the global economy. And actually, I think a very similar issue is faced by the progress of feminism on a global scale, because fundamental to the idea of equality and the empowerment of women is the idea that women ought to have more control over the reproductive process than they have in previous instances. And I completely support this. I myself am child-free and hope always to be child-free. And I think that, reaching that position is, you can justify it through self-interest or ethical issues, but actually it's quite rational, perhaps especially rational for women, to conclude that child-free is the best way to be, especially given that the process of pregnancy and childbirth damages women's bodies. So I was actually kind of surprised and this shows my blind side, to work out through my interactions with people on the internet that actually women are more likely to be child-free than men, because I'd always felt that there was some grand conspiracy on the part of women to manipulate me and other men into marriage and the role of provider for children, and was quite relieved to find that actually women are more likely to share my reservations about reproduction than men, although actually probably not about marriage so far. Hopefully they'll wake up to that one. But, okay, what's the point of this video? The point of this video is simply that when you look at the current situation, countries which have made great progress when it comes to empowering women to to make sensible choices over the reproductive process tend to have much lower fertility rates, and it's fairly obvious that's an inevitable consequence of feminist ideology and the empowerment of women. Because before, I think so many women were having children and so many men were having children because of societal pressures and socialization, and religions obviously play a huge part in that, which is one of the reasons they're often deemed to be patriarchal, because they're so obsessed with controlling reproductive processes. In fact, it seems to have become the be-all and end-all of a lot of religions, even though, like, in Christianity, Jesus never had kids and never got married, and yet somehow Christianity's become this, like, family values cult. Don't even get me started on that one. But, the countries with the highest rates of fertility and child production and population replenishment and growth are essentially the highly religious patriarchal cultures. And I think this raises an obvious issue as to the sustainability of global feminism. And again, this is not to say that feminism is incorrect or that an individual woman ought not to be a feminist. An individual woman absolutely ought to be a feminist, as ought a man to be, because it's right and it's fair and it's just and it's in line with reality and truth, and in, I think, everybody's best interests, actually, except the interests of those people who want grandchildren and the propagation of their genetics because they think that's important. That's actually, as far as I'm concerned, the very basis of patriarchy, is simply the fact that parents want grandkids, right? And all of the manipulation and all of the obsession around controlling everybody's sexuality, including men's, with all the homophobia stuff, is really all about that. Parents justifying their own resentments and sacrifices by making sure they get some grandkids out of it. God, this video I'm digressing all the time, aren't I? Issues. Yeah, I have issues, fucking hell, from that. But anyway, it seems like there's a bit of an inevitable process whereby the liberated countries with strong unions for women will basically shrink in size. And we also know that our moral values largely come from our mothers and from women who are often teachers, or more likely to be making up the bulk of the teaching population. And so, yeah, I kind of wonder if feminism will always lead to a relative demographic death spiral, and the people who are producing children in large numbers are unlikely to be indoctrinating feminist ideology into their children. They're likely to be indoctrinating patriarchal ideology, which will, I think, always have a kind of edge. So it's like, it's like survival of the fittest. The most moral and the most virtuous and true may not always survive. The ones that survive are simply the ones that survive and reproduce in greatest numbers. And, from this point of view, as a meme, as a cultural meme, feminism does essentially have a similarity to a kind of virus or disease that lowers fertility levels. And it's obvious then, if you compare two populations, one which have this virus that lowers fertility levels and one which does not, which society is going to flourish in terms of numbers the most. So I think, I guess the point of this is this video is to say that potentially on a global scale, feminism and feminist cultures will always inevitably be a minority, and you may have a kind of strange situation, which to some extent we have. We're not to some extent, we clearly have it, which is that the wealthier feminist nations end up supporting and financially supporting the economies of these very patriarchal, much poorer societies, which in terms of population outnumber them. So strange paradoxes and a big challenge to global feminism. And I know many of you watching this will just say, oh, good. And I suppose that's your prerogative. I do tend to think that the ideal future is a feminist one, but I am also, as a realist, thinking about that particular issue, think that that might be quite a significant challenge to achieving that goal. So if you have any alternative narratives or counter arguments, please do share them in the comments below, because I'd be genuinely quite interested to read them. Perhaps you can think of a way that feminism can triumph globally in the face of these demographic challenges.